through the core of your graduate program. So I would argue that what you are being exposed to is potentially very useful to you as a person who questions those approaches. So we might come to graduate school and say, my aim is to learn from the masters and not to question what they teach us, but to learn to be a practitioner as thoroughly and with as much cunning as possible. On the other hand, we might say, well, this is very powerful and interesting work, but it has a particular history to it. And that these methods have developed out of a particular culture, which has viewed as one of its primary aims controlling not just and exploiting not just nature, the physical world, but also human beings. And you have the opportunity, I would argue, those of you who might question the sufficiency of what you're being taught, are in a great position to work with each other to develop critiques, to bring in other sources of knowledge, to expand what is being taught to you. Because, you know, in the first part of your question, you referred to our generation. And that's the glory, in some ways, of each new generation, is to be able to develop new ideas, and you're not stuck with what my generation is giving you. It's your duty, in a way, to expand that, to ask questions, and to develop alternative approaches. And if you do so with recognition to your cultures and the principles of justice and democracy that I think should drive anyone who's in public health, then you'll bring about potentially a better kind of science, a better epidemiology, or whatever field you're in, a better public health practice. And whether you do so in a university setting or in another setting, I think it's tremendously valuable, not just because of what you do, but because of how you affect others. And that you do so as part of a community.
Sorry, so you find a problem, say, for instance, industrial farms in North Carolina are causing health problems. How do you go about changing it, and where does the responsibility lie for trying to fix or stop problems? Is it the original epidemiologist who discovered the problem? Is it somebody you pass it off to? Where do you go next with it when you find a problem?
So your question is about a topic that I've been working on for almost 20 years now, about 20 years. And I would first say in this particular instance, but I would say in many instances, the epidemiologist or some other academic or professional, I think usually doesn't discover the problem. I certainly couldn't claim to have discovered the problem, in the sense that the people who experience the problem know it firsthand. So the way I would, begin was by saying, I was taught about the problem by people who know it firsthand.
Okay.
And maybe I've had the privilege of being able to be involved in communicating about the problem to others. As far as who's involved in changing things, I would have to say it depends. Not everybody has the same interests and skills and proclivities. So some people might feel that they would never agree to testify in court because they couldn't imagine themselves in a situation that is in some ways a form of combat. But other people would decide, yes, I want to do that. And so there are degrees. I would say at one end of the spectrum, and I think through the years I've known, I would say maybe this is the modal population of academics, are people who don't talk to journalists because they fear they might be misquoted, or that their colleagues would find their comments to be improperly nuanced. And therefore say, my job is to publish papers in academic journals, and it's other people's jobs to do something with that. That's where my responsibility ends. To people who, at the other end of the spectrum, might run for political office. Like something I would never consider doing myself. But there are people who actually do that. Yeah, right? Bill can tell us. And so there's a huge range. And at least for me, I feel that if you're in public health, as opposed to, for example, a department of biology or economics or sociology or something, that we, because we have this tradition, have more responsibility to engage with the world. Because our field, even in some older definitions of epidemiology, our field is not just about producing knowledge, it's about producing better public health. But I would say there's no one answer. We have to find our place, and in some ways, the place finds us, because we don't choose those circumstances that we end up in. And at least from my experience, often the question is not what we seek out purposefully, but the question is, are we ready to take an opportunity if it presents itself? Have we prepared ourselves to take on a responsibility that we might not have had before?
I want to hear more about your community engagement, specifically within the field of epidemiology. A lot of my work involves community-based participatory research, mostly in health behavior, and just seeing how difficult that is. I don't know if it's necessarily more expensive, but just much more time consuming, and I definitely understand why a lot of researchers would be discouraged from using it, especially I guess within epidemiology, which is arguably a more positivist field. What has been your experience with that, and what level of community engagement I guess do you engage in with your work?
Well, I agree, it's very difficult. There are lots of academic incentives within our institutions to avoid participatory research because it is time consuming and because it requires working with people who don't have our culture. So if you think about university professionals or government professionals for that matter, the easiest people for them to work with are the people who hold degrees in the same fields and have the same jargon, the same language, who share a lot of values, you know, who happen to be racially and culturally similar most of the time. So that's the comfort zone, which means that most, in my experience, most government and university work is conducted in partnership with people in power. So it's participatory, much of it's participatory. Think about, for example, our work with pharmaceutical companies, highly participatory. It's really community-based participatory research because the drug companies have nonprofit trade associations that fund journals and conferences, and they need academics not only for their scientific expertise, but because they provide legitimation. It's not just commercial research, it's research being conducted at universities, which might have buildings or even schools named after people who are associated with the pharmaceutical industry. So those, I classify that as community-based participatory research, generically speaking, because there's a community with whom we partner, and we have very close, we have cultural connections. You know, it fits all the criteria. When you use the term, of course, when it's most often used, community is a euphemism. It's not just any community. So it's not the Chemical Manufacturers Association of America or something. It's, by communities we mean people of low income, people of color, people who are excluded from the resources and the power exercised by our dominant institutions. And who I would note, who are exploited for profit by those institutions. So, that's where I think it's really exciting to work myself. Because those are where the big public health problems are. So, you know, the United States, according to the 2013 World Fact Book from the United States Central Intelligence Agency, out of 224, I think it is, reporting countries or nation equivalents, the United States ranks, I think, 51st in infant mortality and life expectancy. That's pretty bad.
Yeah.
We're the richest country that has ever existed on the earth, and we rank 51st in these basic measures of, we call them public health measures, they're really measures of mortality. It's not because the privileged people of the United States are having poor health. It's because we have such phenomenal disparities. So if we want to be engaged with public health problems, we'll work on the kinds of problems that I gather you're interested in with community-based participatory research. The problem is that our institutions, our universities, for example, are oriented towards, we are structured to capture resources. and to use them to generate more resources through prestige, through the scientific publication system. And when we have relationships with people with few resources, our institutions want to dominate, whether we intend that or not. So we have an overhead system for our grants that takes roughly 50%. Well, the concerned citizens of Carborough or whatever community-based organization can't take 50%. They're going to get a small amount of money through their relationship with a university. While the university captures by far, our salaries are higher, we get benefits, people working in communities don't have medical insurance, they don't have pension benefits, they don't have paid vacation, which is what we're given in our institution. And that costs money. So there's this real inequality as we work with other communities. That's a big problem. And of course, the funding for what's typically referred to as community-based participatory research is very low compared to other. Most of the funding from the National Institutes of Health is not about public health. It's not about health at all. It's about disease. Because disease is an engine of profit in our system, whereas health is expensive and threatens profits. And our government is very tied into that. So these are all institutional barriers. That's why I'm bringing this up. So those of us who would choose in our personal careers to work in CBPR have to deal with those structural issues on a daily basis. And so that's where our respect for other people and our engaging in relationships over long periods of time is really important. And I guess I've found that what's maybe most important for me is identifying. So I would say that my best experiences have come when communities have reached out to me, not when I've gone out to look for. I don't go out to look for communities to work with. Because I feel like that is the origin of a lot of colonial relationships between universities and community organizations. Universities need a community partner in order to get a grant, and they go out and look around to try and find somebody who will fit the grant criteria. And in those situations, the community organizations end up being in a role that might be similar to the leaders of a colony that are benefiting from colonialism at the expense of the general population of the colony. That's the history of colonialism and imperialism. But we're doing that often on a very small scale in our universities, in our relationships with communities. So, at least from my experience, the best situations come when communities come to me and they ask for assistance or support in what they're working on. And the community organizations, therefore, have their own integrity before I'm involved. And I would say that maybe the most important feature of any relationship that's going to be healthy and progressive in CBPR is that the community organization from the very beginning feels that they can fire the researcher whenever they feel disrespected or that the relationship is not producing what they need. If the community-based organization feels like, well, if we just string this along, we'll get some more money from the university, then it becomes a commercial kind of relationship that ultimately ends up being exploitative. And then I would mention one other thing in my overly long response to your question, is that I'm sure that you're viewing CBPR as an approach, as a philosophy, as something that should guide us in terms of our principles and our ethics. And that's where I think it should be. But I would also note that in universities, CBPR is sometimes taught as a method. Well, you can conduct research based on public records, or you can conduct a case control study, or you can conduct CBPR in the sense of it's a method. And it's used that way as a method because CBPR can be used not only for purposes of seeking justice, but to exploit people. So I learned this when I was in graduate school. Very long, when I was first in this demography program, which was funded at the time that the United States government was putting money into what was called the population problem. People of color around the world were reproducing at far too great a rate. And the United States needed to control fertility. And what was discovered very quickly was that the United States would send its emissaries through public health programs, through the Peace Corps, through the Agency for International Development, all kinds of programs to try to convince women in other countries to use birth control. And it didn't work. Because here are these white people coming who are very privileged with their programs, and oh my goodness, people don't trust us, the white people would say, oh, the people who live in these countries, they don't trust us, and they're ignoring what we're telling them, even though it's good for them. So then it was realized, oh well, we need to understand their culture. And we need to build trust. We need to go spend time in the community and learn to speak the local language and better understand the social relationships and the power structures. So there was, and there still is, a very concerted effort on the part of institutions that are trying to control other people to understand their cultures and use that understanding and the trust that would be built to control people. So I bring that up as a kind of warning because I think, while I agree that, CBPR has been very important to me because I find it to be a rich source of research questions and of potential to create knowledge that might help people in their struggles to improve their communities. I also think it can be used for dark purposes. I mean by that, for purposes that are not open, they're not in the light, they're hidden agendas, and I think most of the time the people who are involved in the work don't are not aware of it themselves. People are very, I think for the most part, people in public health have great motives. And they don't want to participate in unjust systems. But those systems are pervasive. And so it requires a lot of self-education, because we're not getting that education in our universities. It requires a lot of self-education, at least it has for me, to seek out information about how the systems work, often to oppress others rather than to create social justice. Is that helpful?
That was definitely helpful in this. I'd like to follow up with you probably one-on-one about, I guess, the specific, well, yeah, I'll try to talk with you later.
Yeah, I just have a question, kind of similar to Vanessa and the CPR, because that's what, we do with SHARE. So we're in the Department of Social Medicine where we do the CPR, and in the introduction, Vic has said how, I guess here in the epidemiology department, CPR isn't that big, and you talked about the institutional barriers. And we talked about it in class, you go out into the community just because you get a grant funded, but then you don't have a lot of grants funding CPR. So where does that conversation start? And I ask that because another project we're working on in the center is looking at the Common Pool, and seeing how we could make recommendations or just analyzing the comments submitted to the Common Pool to protect communities. So where, even all the way from the top to ethics, where does the conversation start on how to shift kind of to more CPR focused research?
Well, I think it starts with different community organizations in different places. So some community organizations may actually think that the university is there to help them. And they may not be aware of the exploitative potential of the university. So in that case, the conversation needs to start about, well, how does the university really work? What are the motives of the university? I like to be able to talk about UNC, Chapel Hill. For example, our university, the first state university in the nation, was created by the slave owners to educate their male children. And it was built by slaves, and it represented the interests of the slave-owning class. Now, some people would like to think that that history has been completely erased. I don't personally think so. I think our university still represents the interests of the ruling classes, if I can use such a vulgar term. Or if I were to be using the language of, 2008 or 9, I would say the interests of the 1%. And we have a lot of rhetoric about how we work to improve the lives of everyone and reduce health disparities and all this stuff, but I think for the most part it is rhetoric. Because we're not really changing our society. Because to do so would require challenging fundamental economic interests that are in government. The university is constrained. Our budget's set by the state legislature. Who's in the state legislature? How do people get elected there? They get campaign contributions from major corporations and from the trade associations that represent them and from wealthy individuals. If we are too strident in our work to oppose those things, that could hurt our budget. We better be careful, So I would start with a conversation like that. If you're entering into a partnership with the UNC Department of Social Medicine, let's talk about what UNC really, what its role is in our society. And actually the way I view it, and I think the way a lot of the partners I've worked with view it, is that their partnership isn't really with the university. It's with a small group of individuals that we make arrangements. And to be honest, we talk about how can we subvert the interests of the university in order to support the communities. And there are some community organizations that are more experienced that understand this right away. And I would say especially organizations that have connections with the historical movements that I would argue have brought about some of the greatest public health improvements in our country. The civil rights movement, the labor movement, the women's movement, movement for LGBTQ people, movements for social justice are really important. And people who are schooled in those movements tend to have more political education and have a better understanding. It goes back to the question that I answered at the very beginning that Bill asked, about my elementary school teachers. If you think that we live in a country where everybody's equal and it's democracy and rah-rah USA, we're bringing democracy to the world and we're patriots, we're going to have a problem in our relationships in these discussions that you raise that need to happen with the community organizations. So if community groups are prepared for that by their prior political education, then you really have something great to start with. If they're not, then there are actually a lot of resources that you can find that are out there that are associated with movements for social justice to help people who didn't go to college, who aren't in the kind of privileged situations that we're in, to learn about America and its history and how it works.
Our clock is about over, so I want to come sit next to you so I can get in my own video here.
Oh, okay.
You have to say something.
First of all, thank you. I mean, that was really inspiring and insightful and
scary.
Perhaps. Some of the things that you say are things that I've been thinking about, and I always admire your eloquence in putting into words things that I've tried to put into words and not succeeded nearly as well. The idea, for example, that we are actually involved in CBPR all the time. There is a community that is influencing and we are responding to. It's just not the community that a lot of people think of when they say CBPR. I'm a little less, or I have a somewhat, you could call it rosier, I might call it positive perspective on what the university's role and interests are. The university is a phenomenon that emerges from the competing influences of various groups and people. And it's not all one thing. And in fact, the ability to have this discussion in itself is an indication that there is a freedom here that there is not in many other places. Certainly in other countries and also in other universities. So it's not all dominated by the 1% and the political interest. But clearly they have a lot of they have a lot of influence. And we are not a democracy in the way that a lot of people imagine democracy is. Everybody's equal. We all come to some informed collective opinion and judgment and so on. Far from it. But it's a lot different from countries where they pull out the guns and start shooting their way to the top, and once they're in power.
Well, you know, we do that too.
We do that. We don't tend to do it in the United States as much.
Well, you know,
Yes,
talk to Black Lives Matter movement people.
I know, and on
But-
Thursday there's going to be a lecture giving the mapping of police violence.
Mhm.
Yes. However, it's not happening as widely as it does
Right.
in some other countries.
Yeah.
So, you know, rule of the people, when you give power to the people,
Mhm.
remember that people's behavior over the millennia has not always been so wonderful that you think that they are really going to rule in an enlightened fashion. So, I think it's better to have rule of the people as opposed to rule of a few people, but the people themselves are motivated by the kinds of drives that drive the system. We want resources, we want our progeny to succeed, men want women to do what men want, women to some extent get a chance to have men do what they want. I mean, we are biological creatures, and in biology there are all manner of examples of how different organisms and species influence each other and try to extract from the environment and from each other what they can. So I guess I have a similar perspective as you do, but I don't see it as being necessarily because of a warped system, but maybe because of a system that's not operating as well as it could. And that it is possible with a lot of these same institutions to have a much better functioning society. I certainly hope so, because if we don't do that, then what you were describing as here's what could happen within the next hundreds of years